The probate lawyer closed the file, looked at my parents, and said, "That is the full estate." That was the moment my mother smiled. Not a wide smile. Not the kind anyone could accuse her of enjoying too much. Just that small, polished little curve she used when something had gone exactly her way and she trusted the room was too formal for anyone to call it cruelty. The hearing room was cold, too bright, and smelled like old coffee and paper. My father sat beside her, with his hands folded on the table, already calm. Their attorney had a black folder in front of him, every page tabbed, every sentence prepared. Across from them sat me, with my grandfather's old canvas overnight bag at my feet, listening as 2 years of family assumptions became official facts. The house on Willow Ridge Road went to my parents. So did the truck, the lower fields, the workshop, the equipment, the checking account, the farm tools, the timber rights, even the old gun cabinet my father had spoken about like an inheritance before Grandpa was even buried. Every item ended in the same place. Them. Then the lawyer turned one final page and said, almost like an afterthought, "A detached recreational structure on non-income acreage, referred to informally as the West Cabin, is conveyed separately to granddaughter Claire Mercer." My mother let out a soft laugh. The West Cabin. That was what I got. A rotting one-room structure 12 minutes off the highway, past a washed-out cattle gate and a stand of cedar trees. No plumbing, no real heat, warped window frames, rusted hinges. A place Grandpa used during hunting season, and later when he wanted quiet, which in his language meant distance from people asking him for signatures. My father called it useless. My mother called it sentimental. Their lawyer called it a specific devise of little market consequence. I called it the only thing they had not bothered to fight me for. When the hearing ended, my mother stood first and adjusted the cuff of her sleeve. "Well," she said, "I hope now you can finally move on." Move on. As if I had been clinging to grief for attention instead of watching my family turn my grandfather into inventory. My father picked up the truck keys their attorney had placed near the file and slid them into his pocket without looking at me. "It's all legal, Claire," he said. "Don't start inventing conspiracies because you're disappointed." Disappointed. That was the word my family used when they had erased you in public and expected you to thank them for doing it neatly. Their lawyer handed me one envelope from the probate stack. Inside was the cabin deed, a county parcel map, and a small ring of keys attached to a rusted brass tag. No note, no letter, no explanation. Just the cabin. My mother glanced at the key ring and smiled again. "He always knew you liked old things." I looked at her and said nothing, because if I had opened my mouth in that moment, grief, rage, and humiliation would have come out all at once, and I had already learned something important in that room. They were prepared for emotion. They were prepared for me to cry, accuse, shake, sound bitter, sound unstable, sound like the disappointed granddaughter they had already explained away. What they were not prepared for was silence. So I picked up my bag, the deed, the rusted key, and walked out of probate with less than my grandfather used to tip waiters at Christmas. 2 bags. 1 rusted key. 1 cabin nobody wanted. I drove there that same afternoon because I had nowhere else to take the truth. The lock stuck twice before the key finally turned. The cabin smelled like cedar dust, cold stone, and old canvas. There was a cast iron stove in the corner, a narrow bed frame, a cracked enamel sink with no running water, and Grandpa's workbench sitting beneath the window. A faded landscape painting hung crooked on the back wall. On the shelf beside the stove were 3 tins of nails, a lantern, and a box of matches old enough to have survived several presidents. It was worse than I remembered, and somehow better, because the cabin did not pretend to love me while reaching into my pocket. That first night, I slept in my coat under 2 army blankets and woke before sunrise with my teeth aching from the cold. On the second day, I cleaned mouse droppings out of the cupboards and found coffee mugs wrapped in newspaper. On the third, I drove into town for canned soup, lamp oil, and a battery radio. On the fourth, I found Grandpa's old thermos under the bed. On the fifth, I noticed the west wall made a hollow sound when the wind pushed against it. On the sixth night, rain started after midnight and would not stop. I could not sleep, so I lit the lantern and began straightening the room. The painting over the bed had bothered me since I arrived. It did not just hang crooked, it hung wrong, too low on one side. Like someone had taken it down and rushed to put it back. I lifted it off the hook. Behind it was a shallow recess cut between the wall studs. Inside sat a sealed envelope made of thick cream paper. My grandfather's handwriting was across the front, Claire, and beneath my name, one sentence. Open this after they think they've won. I did not open it immediately. That was the first smart thing I did all week. I sat on the edge of the bed with the lantern between my knees and stared at his handwriting until my hands stopped shaking enough to break the seal cleanly. Inside was a 4-page letter, a folded survey map, and a smaller key taped to an index card. The card had 3 words on it. Not the cabin. I unfolded the letter. Claire, if you are reading this after Daniel and Margaret walked out of probate smiling, then the hearing went exactly the way I expected. Let them have the loud things. The house, the truck, the lower fields, the tools they will sell too quickly, the land they think they understand because they can point at it from the road. The cabin was never the gift. It was the cover. I read that line twice. Then I kept going. 3 years ago, after your father began speaking about my death like it was a scheduling issue, I moved the only thing that mattered out of probate. Quiet paper lasts longer than family promises. Do not call them. Do not call the lawyer who closed the file. Do not tell anyone what you find until you have the whole packet. Lift the stoveplate. Take the tin box. Use the smaller key at First County Bank, box 214. Bring the trust certificate and the Ridge survey. Trust certificate. My pulse changed. Not fear now. Recognition. Because my grandfather never used legal words casually. If he wrote trust certificate, there was a trust certificate. If he wrote survey, there was something on that land the probate lawyer had not read because it had never belonged in the probate file. I crossed to the cast iron stove and lifted the loose plate on the right side. Underneath sat a black metal tin. Inside were 6 documents, 2 keys, and a plastic sleeve containing a survey map bigger than my torso. The first paper said exactly what his letter promised. Certificate of Trust. Mercer Ridge Land Trust. Trustee during life, Harold Mercer. Successor beneficiary upon death, Claire Mercer. Trust property. West Cabin Tract and reserved appurtenant rights as described in Schedule A. I turned to Schedule A. The first line made me stop breathing. The West Cabin Tract was not 5 useless acres around a broken hunting shack. It was 68 acres. 68. The cabin sat on the least important corner of it. The rest ran behind the ridge, through cedar, down along the old spring line. And then I saw the part that changed everything. The tract controlled the only deeded access road servicing the lower farm parcels my parents had just inherited. I read faster. Reserved rights attached to the trust tract included primary spring water rights, servicing the main house and lower pasture, deeded access easement across Ridge Road, timber revenue escrow from selective harvest contract, approval rights for utility, development, or easement crossings affecting the lower parcels. I sat down on the floor. Not because I was overwhelmed, because my legs had simply decided they were finished. My parents had walked out of probate with the visible estate. Grandpa had left me the part the visible estate depended on. The road, the water, the timber escrow, the approval rights. While they were fighting over loud property, the actual leverage had been sitting inside a cabin wall under a painting nobody wanted badly enough to straighten. The next document was a notarized memorandum signed by Grandpa and recorded 18 months before he died. The language was dry, exact, and beautiful in the way only devastating paperwork can be. Any conveyance, mortgage, development, or subdivision of the lower Mercer parcels shall remain subject to rights reserved in the Mercer Ridge Land Trust. No holder of such lower parcels may impair road access, spring access, revenue access, or trust beneficiary consent rights. Then the next line stopped me cold. Daniel Mercer and Margaret Mercer are aware of these retained rights and have no authority over the trust tract or its proceeds. Aware. Not surprised. Not forgotten. Not accidentally left out. Aware. I looked back at Grandpa's letter. If they are smiling in probate, they are smiling because they think what I left you is too small to matter. That will last until they try to use what they took. Then I understood. This was not a sentimental reversal. It was a timed one. The next morning, I called First County Bank from the cabin landline because cell service came and went out there. I gave my name, Grandpa's name, and the box number. The woman on the other end went quiet for a moment too long. Then she said, "Miss Mercer, were you instructed to contact us after probate?" My hand tightened around the receiver. "Yes." I heard typing. Then she said, very carefully, "You will need identification and the trust certificate. And Miss Mercer?" "Yes." "There is also a notice in the file stating that any inquiry from Daniel or Margaret Mercer is to be documented but not discussed." I looked down at the papers spread across Grandpa's table. He had not just hidden something from them. He had expected them to come looking. I drove into town with the letter, the trust certificate, the survey, and the smaller key inside my bag. When I walked into First County Bank, the woman at the desk asked my name, checked her screen, and her expression changed. Not warm. Not surprised. Prepared. She stood and said, "Miss Mercer, the estate packet in box 214 includes a current trust asset summary." I followed her into a private room. Before she opened the box, she paused. "You should know," she said, "the listed value is larger than the probate estate read yesterday." The box was smaller than I expected. That was the first surprise. The second was how little inside it was sentimental. No watch, no photographs, no medals wrapped in cloth. Just documents. A thick trust binder. 2 sealed envelopes. A current asset summary on bank letterhead. A cashier's envelope marked Timber Escrow. And 1 handwritten note clipped to the front in Grandpa's blocky hand. "Read the summary before the letters. The number matters." So I did. At the top was the name I had seen in the cabin. Mercer Ridge Land Trust. Below that were the assets. Ridge Tract and Cabin Parcel, 68 acres. Springwater rights, servicing lower Mercer parcels. Deeded access road and maintenance rights. Timber Escrow Reserve. Development consent rights, affecting utility and easement approvals. Option agreement held in trust. Then my eyes dropped to the valuation column. I read the number once. Then again. Current trust value, $1,482,600. I sat back in the chair. Not because I was emotional. Because the number did not belong to the reality I had carried out of probate in an envelope. My parents had fought over Grandpa's house, truck, tools, and lower land. Grandpa had left me something worth more than all of it put together. And it became worse for them on the next page. The option agreement was active. 9 months before he died, Grandpa had signed an option with the County Water Authority. They wanted the spring corridor, the ridge access strip, and controlled easement rights for a protected water project. The trust could either keep the land and collect annual licensing payments or exercise a sale option within 180 days of the successor beneficiary accepting control. Option exercise value, $1,100,000. Separate from the timber escrow. I stared at the page until the numbers stopped moving. Grandpa had not left me a sad cabin. He had left me the ridge, the road, the spring, the option, the timber money, and the rights every lower parcel depended on. Then I opened the first sealed envelope. Inside were copies of certified letters. 1 to my father, 1 to my mother, 1 to the probate attorney. All sent 18 months before Grandpa died. Each letter acknowledged the Mercer Ridge Land Trust, the exclusion of the trust assets from probate, and the retained rights burdening the lower parcels. Each one warned that any attempt to treat the estate as complete or unburdened without reference to the trust would be false. At the bottom of my father's receipt was his signature. He had known, not guessed, not suspected, known. The second envelope held Grandpa's final note. Claire, if Daniel smiles at probate, it is because he thinks loud property is the same as control. He will learn. Do not rush to confront them. Let them use what they won. They will discover the trap when they try to sell, borrow, divide, or improve what they took. Then take the meeting with Miss Vance. She has the rest. The bank woman knocked once and asked if I wanted the trust attorney called. I said yes. Margot Vance arrived 40 minutes later with a legal pad, a file tube, and the face of a woman who had been waiting months for the right person to finally show up. She sat across from me and opened the binder. Your grandfather expected this, she said. He did not expect your parents to respect the trust. He expected them to ignore it until they hit the first wall. What wall? She slid the survey toward me. The ridge tract wrapped behind the cabin, yes, but it also held the only road wide enough for equipment access to the lower south field. The spring line fed the main house and pasture troughs. The utility consent language meant no development, refinancing, parcel split, or major easement work could move cleanly without the trust beneficiary's sign-off. The estate your parents took, she said, tapping the map, is visible land. This trust is functional land. Visible land. Functional land. That line stayed with me. Then she handed me a title memo her office had received that morning. My parents had already triggered the first wall. At 8:26 a.m., before I even opened box 214, my father had contacted a lender about using the main house and south field as collateral for a restructuring loan. The lender's title review found the trust burden immediately. Water rights. Access dependency. Recorded consent limitations. The loan was paused. At 9:14, a buyer's agent for part of the timber parcel requested an updated commitment. Also paused. At 10:02, my parents' lawyer called Margot Vance and asked whether the trust rights were truly enforceable. Her response had been one sentence. They are the only enforceable part left. I laughed then. Not loudly. Just once. Because the timing was too perfect not to admire. My parents had walked out of probate believing they had won everything. They had not even made it to lunch before the estate began collapsing under the part Grandpa left me. By 3 that afternoon, my phone started ringing. My mother first. Then my father. Then the probate lawyer. Then my father again. I ignored the first 4 calls. On the 5th, I answered. My father did not waste time. What did he leave you? There it was. No grief. No softness. Not even, we need to talk. Just the real question, finely stripped of costume. I looked at the trust papers spread across Margot Vance's table and said, something bigger. Silence. Then his voice lowered. You need to be reasonable. I learned that from probate. The house needs that spring. I know. The lower road crosses your tract. I know. The lender froze everything over a technical issue. No, I said. A recorded one. He breathed through his nose, angry now, controlled, but barely. What do you want? Not an apology. Not forgiveness. A settlement question. The kind asked by people who believe every moral disaster can still become a number if they catch it early enough. I looked at Margot. She gave a small nod. So I answered clearly. I want the truth placed back into the estate record. I want the probate inventory corrected. I want written acknowledgement that you knew about the trust before the hearing. I want every attempt to use the lower parcels without trust disclosure withdrawn, and from now on, all contact goes through counsel. He said my name the way he used to when I was a child and had embarrassed him in front of guests. I hung up before he finished. 3 weeks later, the probate inventory was amended. The house, truck, and lower parcels stayed with my parents under the estate, but every useful part of those assets had to be disclosed as burdened by the Mercer Ridge Land Trust. Their refinancing died. The timber buyer walked away. The The lawyer, who had closed the file and said, "That is the full estate," filed a supplemental correction acknowledging that it was not. And my parents stopped telling people Grandpa had made everything simple. Margot's office made sure of that. I did not exercise the county sale option right away. That surprised everyone except Grandpa, who probably counted on it. I kept the cabin. I kept the ridge. I kept the road and the spring and the right to decide what crossed that land. 6 months later, when I was ready, I negotiated the water authority option myself on better terms than the original number in the file. That was the real inheritance. Not just the money, though there was more than enough of that. Control. My parents took everything Grandpa owned at Probate. They walked out with the loud estate. I walked out with 2 bags, 1 rusted key, an old cabin, and the only part of his world that still made the rest of it work. So tell me honestly, would you have opened the envelope that first night or waited until daylight?